So I'm Kylan Browning. I run the service side of things here at Superfly, and that's going to include, reserve repacks, repairs, inspections, anything that needs to be done periodically or after an accident or anything like that. When I first started here, Chris Santacroce really taught me a lot with the repairs as well as like line replacements and trim tunes and inspections. So I was able to go and take what he taught me, talk with other people around the States and heck, even around the world, and see how they would act to certain, whether it's damage or whether it's anything that can be done to a glider. I want to know how they do it to make sure that when a glider is brought into me, that it's done correctly. What I look for in an inspection to make sure a glider is safe to fly or airworthy really depends on, I'd say, three major things. It's gonna be the porosity, line strength, and then if there's any tears or any subsequent damage to the glider itself. So the first thing that we always do is a porosity check, and that basically just checks the amount of air that can move through the material in a given amount of time. We have a tool that basically sucks a certain amount of air into a bladder, and it measures the amount of time that it takes to do so. And usually what we see is from factory, they can get anywhere between, I'd say 250 seconds on the low end, all the way up to 600 seconds on some of these newer gliders. Failing is down to 18 seconds. So you can see there's a huge difference there. There's a really wide range of porosities that are okay, but as soon as it gets down to that 18-second mark, it's kind of that question of, are you willing to risk flying your glider when it's in that kind of condition? With low porosity, it can have worse recovery tendencies. So we want to make sure that the porosity is where we want it, or significantly higher than the minimum, to make sure you're flying safely. So another thing we can check is a strength check on the glider material itself. Basically what that is a needle that we poke into the material in different parts of the glider that has a spring in it that's calibrated to pull a certain amount of weight. And you can measure that and see exactly how far it goes before the material tears. Now the amount that's required, the amount of pressure that's required, kind of differs a little bit between company to company, but we want to see those numbers and then far beyond those numbers before we see any tearing, because we don't want you to be close to that threshold. So when I receive a glider that has damage in it, depending on the type of damage, where it is, and how severe it is, changes what I do to fix it. Like say it's a paramotor glider that comes in after a prop strike. I'll go through and completely take apart that section of the glider. I can either build the material back up with patch material, sew that all together, and then add it on, which has a visual look to it. You can clearly see where the repair was, but it's structurally perfect. Or if you want it to look perfect, I can go through and take out that whole section of the glider, whether it's just one panel, or if it's a section of a rib in a panel, or whatever that might include. I can go through and completely replace that with matching materials, so that by the time I'm finished, you can't really see the repair. So if you damage your glider and you don't really know if it's something that you can do yourself or if it's something you should send in to me, you can always shoot us an email, send us some pictures, and we can kind of clarify that for you. A good rule of thumb is if it's just a small tear or a scrape or something in the middle of a cell, not next to the seam, but close to the center. If it's under 4 inches, usually you can get away just with some patch material. Just make sure you're around the edges and make sure you have an inch of clearance on each side. That way you know you have really, really good adhesion and it's not just gonna come back off on you. Now if it's something that's a little more intense than just a small tear, say it's gonna be on the seam where the stitching itself is damaged, or maybe the stitching pulled through the material and it tore right along the stitch line. And that's when I want to be able to go in and either rebuild it or replace the panel next to it, so that way we can make sure that everything is as strong as possible. Things that cause a glider to fail in inspection, I'd say most common is probably the porosity. Porosity is one of those things that you can't fix, so at that point the glider is just kind of done. Another thing that might cause your glider to fail inspection is if the repair itself would cost more than it's worth. Most people would kind of choose to go away from that and just put that money that would have cost to fix their glider into a new one. So after I finish a repair, I always make it a thing to go and kite the glider afterwards. Basically, I want to make sure that everything checks out. Every change that I made was exactly what the glider needed. I want to make sure that when I'm kiting it, I can see the repair, but it's not going to be something that sticks out to you. I want it to be as invisible as possible. If I'm doing a panel replacement, I don't want to see creases, I don't want to see folds. I want to make sure that it's a smooth panel and that everything is the way that it was before the accident. So between companies that we have here, we've got Gin, Nova, and Advance. Each one of those companies, they have a really high standard for their gliders. The durability, the quality of everything is pretty close to being similar, but ultimately it is what you pay for. Advance, for example, they tend to have the cleanest and I'd say probably most precise construction out of the 3 companies that carry. They're always really, really attentive to the details. You get what you pay for. Parts of the glider that wear out the most. One thing that I've noticed over the years is porosity definitely goes down when you go towards the wingtips. Now, I don't have any real reason for it, but the speculation that I have is if most people are flying in the morning and the afternoon, you have the sun low on the horizon. Because of that reason, I tend to think that the porosity and maybe the material strength on the wingtips is a little bit lower, just because they generally have the more direct sunlight. Another thing that really affects which part of the glider is damaged the most. If you're in rocky conditions and you tend to let the leading edge slam on the ground or scrape across the ground at all, the section of the leading edge that contacts the ground, so right where the rib stiffeners are, usually is the first to go. Anytime your glider contacts the leading edge on the ground, it's basically sanding it away. If you take a piece of sandpaper to the leading edge of your glider, you're gonna notice holes pretty quick. And it's that same thing. If you're on cement, you're gonna notice those holes really quick. When you're flying a lot over dirt, or if you're kiting on dirt or sand, the most common thing that I see with that is small rocks and sand building up and getting stuck on the trailing edge of the glider. I've had a few gliders come in here before where I go and turn it upside down and sand is just pouring out of the glider, and that's the last thing I want to see, because obviously that affects the way it flies, it affects the way that it recovers, and it could potentially cause some dangerous situations. But not only that, if you let some pebbles in there and let them stay there for a while, it causes lots of small holes where those are whenever it comes in contact with other rocks or other abrasive or hard surfaces. If you're wondering if it's time to bring your glider in for an inspection or a trim tune, good rule of thumb is once a year. It's kind of one of those things you want to make sure is done periodically, because most of the time there's damage to a glider, you don't actually know it's there. It's something that I'm going to find unexpectedly throughout the inspection process. Repack should be done once a year as well. It's one of those things that the repack is essentially responsible for the reserve being functional. Worst case scenarios, if you have a wet reserve and you let it sit like that for a long time, it gives potential for molding, but it also could get kind of sticky on the inside. Obviously, you don't want to be throwing a brick out of your harness if you have to throw, so make sure that it's dry, make sure that it's repacked once a year, make sure that your reserve is going to work. So reserves kind of has a general rule of thumb that anything over 10 years old should be retired. Nylon materials, any plastics or anything in that such, they do have a lifespan whether you've used them or not. So if your glider, if your reserve, if your harness is over 10 years old, really think about changing that and getting a newer reserve. You don't want to be in a situation where you throw and something catastrophic happens. That reserve is your lifeline. You want to make sure it's good. So when it comes to sending your reserve in for a repack, I try to keep everything down under, I'd say 5 to 10 business days. I really want to make sure that you're going to get everything back to you as quick as possible. Inspections are the same thing. I really like keeping those under 2 weeks as well. It's quite rare that I have a queue that's longer than 2 weeks. So you can expect if you send your gear to us, you're going to see it back pretty quickly. So if you have to send your glider in for a repair or a new line set, or even just a couple lines here and there, pricing definitely does vary. It depends on the severity, how long it's going to take me to repair it, as well as the materials involved. But if it's something like a line set, the price of the line set between gliders changes a little bit. We'll say $600 out the door with the line set installed, completely ready to fly again. We want to make sure it's going to be as economically viable as possible for you guys. Individual lines, doesn't matter what the line is, 25 bucks, I have it replaced. If you bring it in to me, I can go and do the replacement myself, but if we have to ship a line to you, it's gonna be the $25 plus shipping. If you have any questions on how to put the line on, give us a call, FaceTime, email, whatever the case might be, and we'll walk you through the process to make sure you're comfortable with the installation. For the bigger repairs, we do charge by the hour. And so if you have something that's going to take me 6 or 7 hours to complete, obviously the price is going to be a little more significant on that than something as simple as an attachment point repair. We charge $175 for a full inspection. That includes a line break test as well as the strength test of the material itself, just to make sure that everything is in good as condition as possible. For a repack, I charge $65 for a round, $75 for a square, and $100 for a steerable or regalo style reserve. And then for the Beamer 3170s in particular, it's $120. That being said, we don't do things here to make a lot of money off of it. We want to make sure, again, that you get your glider back as quickly and economically as possible and make you feel comfortable and happy with the experience you've had here, as well as just feeling comfortable with your glider itself. It's more important that you're happy and feel safe flying your glider than we make a few extra bucks. I think the most important thing here is we don't want you to be hesitating on bringing your equipment to us to get serviced because of a time frame, because of money. We want to make sure that everything is done as quickly and safely as possible so you can get back in the air as quick as possible. If you ever have any questions on anything at all, the team here at Superfly is always willing to answer any questions and make you feel at home here. So make sure that you send your equipment to us, and we're going to make sure to take care of you as much as possible.